You wouldn't buy a car without a seatbelt, a laptop without Wi-Fi, or go a day without your cell phone. Could a business survive without the internet? Then why are many healthcare providers and provider organizations still not connected and enabled to share critical clinical information digitally in the care of your friends and family? Welcome to Kno2fy, a podcast from Kno2. Join host Dr. Peter Schoch, Chief Health Officer, and Therasa Bell, Founder, President, and CTO, as they bring the profound impact of healthcare communication to life through frank conversation in understandable language and through real-world context. They'll demystify interoperability, helping you unlock the potential of healthcare communication at scale. You'll also learn the transformative impact of being Kno2 connected. Connect, listen, transform.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Kno2fy podcast. The band is back together here. We've been separated for about 3 weeks, and Dr. Schoch has had to hold this up on his own. But actually, during that time, we've had some fantastic interviews with partners, which is a new thing for us on the Kno2fy podcast. Tell us a little bit about that. How did you enjoy those interviews, Dr. Schoch?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It started with Ivy, I think, back in February, and then we had Equip Health, Care Feed, and we've got another one that's going to be released next. That just got released last week, I guess, for one of our EHR partners in the PT space as well. I love it. It's an opportunity to talk in some of those cases to actual end users like Equip Health, as well as the technology partners that we have. And I always learn a lot. Those are the podcasts where I probably talk less, which I enjoy because I tend to learn quite a bit from them. But it's nice to see interoperability in action at the end user level. And it's nice to see technology partners integrating to our APIs and how they're using it pragmatically to solve problems for their end users. That I really get a lot of joy.
Yeah, they were. I get to listen to them, and I love the ones where I'm actually not a part of it, but get to hear that our partners are really seeing the fullness of our APIs by integrating it into the platform. The one I really particularly enjoyed was the Equip Health one, because it just tells you that there's so many different flavors of healthcare. And a lot of times when I ask about, when we talk about healthcare, they'll say, oh, it references a health system or it's a physician. But these just open our eyes wide to what healthcare actually can mean and how impactful we can be. So when we get into things like eating disorders and that very specialized niche part of healthcare, but how we can even impact that in particular, that podcast was really moving to me. To see what an impact we can have that affects a lot of people in I think it was 29 million people in this country are affected by an eating disorder, and we can even impact that with interoperability. So when we talk about using interoperability to solve the biggest problems in healthcare, it's also some of the less known problems in healthcare, but really, really important and really, really big problems. But I did have the opportunity, Dr. Schoch and I have been traveling together here for the last couple of weeks, and I've had the opportunity to be in the audience and experience one. He's an incredible speaker. So for those that haven't seen it, anytime you get an opportunity, I would encourage you to see it. But I was in the audience, being able to participate or view and throw things at Dr. Schoch, being able to, just kidding.
No, but it's intimidating with you in the audience. Here I am speaking on behalf of a technology company. Yes, not about the technology itself, but speaking on behalf of a technology company, and the founder and chief technical officer is sitting in the audience. So there's a little lump in the throat as I start getting into some of the technical features, knowing you're out there. I want to get it right.
A couple times where you probably saw me turn red. I was embarrassed. It was, you did a fantastic job, and much of what you talk about is very provider centric. So it makes a ton of sense that you're leading those conversations. But I got to sit in the audience, and it was an audience of providers, right? So both in the pediatric space and in the home health space. And watch their engagement as there was these conversations around communication and interoperability. And in particular, the pediatric provider audience was interesting to watch because they were being introduced into this concept of interoperability. And in their world, obviously they're dealing with clinical things every day. They don't live this every day. And I forget how much there is to learn and how much I've learned over the last 15 years of doing this. But you sit there in the audience and you put yourselves in their seat to say, okay, we're talking about sharing patient information no longer through the fax machine where I can control the entire experience, and start including the consent, and I'm sharing information, but it's a very managed and tight experience, to now being available through these national networks like Care Quality, and now we're talking about QHIN and Kno2fy, where it's a whole new world of being able to share information at scale. But it introduces a bunch of questions for them and a bunch of concerns, rightly so. And as I was watching the questions that the audience was asking, to yourself and to your co-presenter, I'm putting myself in their shoes and I'm saying, that's really scary to think about that. And then it also presented the question in my mind, which I'm still wrestling with, is how far do we go in attempting to educate our provider community? And how far do we go, and is it necessary versus is the responsibility really on the, let's say it's an electronic health record vendor or any HIT vendor, to create such a seamless experience that they don't have to think about it, and there doesn't have to be this education, and adoption just occurs? Because adoption at the edge, we've talked about it in other podcasts, we've had time on it in other podcasts. How do we make sure that we're getting adoption at the edge? And in this case, when we're talking about the edge, it is the provider community. And we have a good adoption already occurred in these national networks, but it primarily sits in those health systems, and it sits in the more educated or available audience, those that have access to these resources more so than the independent pediatrician or the home health agency that's sitting out in rural America. How far do we take the education? How appropriate is it? And I've wrestled it. I keep going back and forth in my mind. I'd love to get your thoughts on that, maybe to open up the conversation there.
Yeah, first, a couple things. Number one, thank you very much for your kind words about my speaking. It is a true honor and pleasure to be able to do it. And as introverted as I sometimes am, and you know me, I commit to speaking engagements, and then the week before, the day before, think, why did I do this? Because it's not necessarily something that is as comfortable for me as I would like it to be. But I do get energized in engaging provider audiences in the education about what we're doing, and about the impact of interoperability, not about the technical components necessarily, but about the impact of interoperability. And it was really interesting to hear your perspective. And we had shared this perspective even outside of the podcast around, as we were traveling around the audience and the adoption pieces. So I look forward to jumping into that. I think just an initial volley here for the conversation to come, that I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both. I think it's a both and, meaning that I think we have to educate the provider community around how to look for the solutions to their workflow problems in an interoperable solution. And I think but we need to stop talking about the technology of it. We need to be able to explain to providers. See, the providers, and we'll get into this, but the providers have been the curators of the health information before electronic health records interposed themselves, right? So we had responsibilities that we took very seriously, and we still have some of those responsibilities around consent and so forth. But we were the curators of that record, where it went, where it didn't go, how we got it there. We were the curators individually on a one-on-one basis around the information we shared about patients for treatment purposes and so forth. And it's a new field. And so we're going to have to be educated to a level about interoperability and how it works, so to speak, not the technical components of it as much as some of the governance pieces of it, so that we can get comfortable, that we can automate that responsibility, right? Automate those functions that used to be non-automated, that we can scale those functions that we used to have individual control over one at a time. The reality of it is, when I call somebody to tell them about a patient or give them medical information, I completely control what I say about that patient, right? I know everything I say in that conversation, and I curate only the information that's necessary for that provider. Do I know that that's the case when I query for a record on a patient, that provider or somebody queries my record for information on a patient, that information is the exact information I would share that is the most informative for that provider, and I'm comfortable with that type thing. So there are these things that I think we need to wrestle with, and that's why I say it's a both and I look forward to getting into discussion.
Yeah, I think that's it's funny you talk about not getting them into the technology of it, which I completely agree with. I can't tell you how many panels I've sat on with, I'd say, my peers, where the discussion is to a provider audience, and we're discussing things, and I'm watching their faces, their eyes are glazing over, they're trying not to fall asleep, looking at their phone, and I'm like, is anybody reading the clues here? They don't care, they really don't care to solve the problem for them. And I remember being asked a question at one point, this is not that long ago actually, is what do you want the provider community? It was a question that got lobbed to me as one of the panelists, is what would you tell this provider community to learn about TEFCA and QHIN? And I'm quite certain the moderator didn't care for my answer, but nothing. It's like nothing. I hope they never have to learn a thing, and it just is provided to them. But to your point on, there are workflows they need to understand that it impacts. Even on that point, I'd push into that a little bit and say, shouldn't those workflows just happen? And now it just happens differently within whatever technology. If we keep this focus to an electronic health record, shouldn't they just happen? And again, back to the question is, how far should we be educating our providers? I just feel like we place such a burden on the provider community, and the burden is too outweighed. It needs to be on the HIT vendors to do the right thing and really get to thinking about how they're developing the solution, because it shouldn't be an adoption by education. It should be an adoption by really good product. And that's what
No, I like it. And I was just struck by the fact that as a technologist, you're incredibly sensitive to the provider and the provider experience and adoption of interoperability, and hard on the technology folks. And I, as a provider, am sensitive to the technology folks around not understanding what they're actually bringing forward, and hard on the providers for railing against the change that's necessary to actually see the impact of interoperability. Right. So it's a great mix, actually. I think when I think about the technology people in it and the education that we're talking about in interoperability, it's not just education of the providers. I think the technology people who are building solutions, interoperable solutions that drive workflow improvements for healthcare, need to understand the impact of what they're building so that they can actually talk about it with impact and translate the conversation from a technical conversation to, no, Dr. Jones, we're actually improving your medication reconciliation by doing X, Y, and Z, or we're automating that, or we're deduplicating it already for you. And even deduplicate is probably a technical word that doesn't make a lot of sense to most providers. But I just have never known a doctor to go say, I need interoperability. And yet we act like they should be asking us for it. No, they're not. But they're screaming for help in terms of streamlining referrals, about getting CT scans and lab results delivered to them so they can make clinical decisions. They don't really see that as interoperability. They see that as foundational to delivering good healthcare. And we've got to start meeting them where they are and helping educate our technology partners in the space so that they understand how to translate the request of a provider to solve a problem. Hey, they're actually asking for interoperable workflows in their EHR and the ability to connect to the different rest of the healthcare community. Providers shouldn't need to know that. I mean, it's native to us that we need to share information. Why is it not native to technologists that we need to share information and that it impacts these different workflows? And I think there's just cross-pollination and education needs to occur on both sides. Anyway, I know we'll get into the conversation as we come back. So we're going to take a quick break and we'll come back and launch right into the conversation. Equip is the leading virtual eating disorder treatment for all ages and empowers families to help their loved ones recover at home by making evidence-based care accessible and affordable for all. With a dedicated 5-person care team, including experts in medication management, nutrition, therapy, and cultural humility, each patient and family receives personalized support tailored to their unique needs. And the results speak volumes. After just 8 weeks, 8 out of 10 patients report a significant reduction in eating disorder symptoms. Learn more at www.equip.health.
Connect, listen, transform. This is Kno2fy with your hosts, Dr. Peter Schoch and Therasa Bell.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm excited to jump right into the conversation that we teed up here right before the break. But really good discussion about what happens at the edge. What should we be doing to incent adoption at the edge by the provider community? And I've reflected on being able to sit in an audience where Dr. Schoch was speaking to a group of pediatricians, primarily independent pediatricians their electronic health record had just gone live on some of the query networks, the ability to share information. And one of the questions, I think I'll just start here, is one of the questions that the provider asked in the audience, and I thought it was very thoughtful, but it struck me because it's quite opposite from what I'm typically hearing. So the question is, man, if I'm available on these networks and I have a patient that shows up in my office, right? And basically all of a sudden I know this information about this patient. Maybe they were just recently seen at a hospital or they were seen by another provider, and they're sitting in my clinic, and I'm sharing information with them that they didn't share with me. But I'm telling them, hey, how did that visit go? Or, something you want to, express to me about what's happened there. Are they going to be upset that I know something about them that I shouldn't know? Because I had this information readily available to me. And that struck me because, one, I've never heard the question asked that way. Usually what I hear is the frustration of patients saying, like I experienced with my dad, is,
Yeah.
How you didn't know about this information? You're in the healthcare community. Shouldn't you just know this automatically? But that question struck me. And I thought it was quite thoughtful to say, well, if I have somebody show up and I know this, probably considered sensitive information, but it also told me that they just truly don't understand how HIPAA purpose of use of treatment actually flows into these national networks, and that it overflows into that. So coming back to the education question. So not sure what the question is, just lobbing it out there for discussion.
Yeah, no, I remember that question. And that question was actually asked of our technology partner who was co-presenting with me, and I was standing there and had the opportunity to observe their answer and some other feedback in the room as I was there. And I think when I think about that, I put myself, and this is whether it was medication reconciliation, whether it was certification for patient-centered medical home and changing process, depression screening at every visit. There's always a pushback when the process changes, and there are always questions that providers have around that. Oftentimes, the problem is not new, the solution is new, or the way we're handling it's new. So I always try and reorient back to, what do you do now? In a circumstance where you see a patient, you have no information on them, you get all that information by asking them the questions, and then you leave the room and say, I'm going to request your old records. Can you sign a release for old records so that I can get that information shared? And the patient does that 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100 so that we can get that information because they want the doctor to have that information. Now, in that circumstance, the same thing's happening. The information is getting shared. It's just being shared after the visit when it's probably not as timely and as helpful versus being shared before the visit where it's more timely and helpful. So in that regard, it's not a new problem. It's just, how do I communicate that I have that information and it's valuable to me, to a patient? So it's a communication of, hey, we were able through your prior doctor to get your records in advance. When you're treated there, you're consenting to share the records, whatever it is. Just a simple explanation of why you have them, how you've used them, and how they've actually accelerated our ability to care for you in the moment. But it's the same problem, right? It's the same information is going to get shared, whether it's shared in the old way of paper faxes, reams of paper coming across your fax machine after a request is signed in your office for old records from a prior provider, or they're going to come in a digital format, not in reams of paper, before a visit where I actually can use that information to help my patient. And all I have to do is make sure that I'm letting the patient know that I've gotten those records in a secure and compliant way, however you want to phrase that, to put them at ease. I don't know, as most patients that I experienced the vast majority of patients across my career, 20 years, did not have any problem with me having access to their healthcare record from other providers. Whether I asked them for it or whether it was given to me or whether the information was shared over the phone, they actually thought that that was a good thing. There may have been rare circumstances where somebody had told a prior provider about a personal issue or something of that nature that they may not have wanted shared in an electronic record, where they may think that that's a problem. Most of the time when we have those personal things that we're told as a provider, they either go in a special place in our mind around building a relationship. If we think it's impactful to their health or to how they receive healthcare, we might put it in a special place in the chart. But that's not the kind of stuff that's necessarily getting shared here in that circumstance. So I think it's just a matter of that education around the process piece of it. There's nothing different here. And I don't think the doc needs to worry about explaining the configuration of the national networks and so forth. I think a simple statement around when you sign up for care and treatment, you're signing a consent to share information for the purposes of treating you better. That means that I can share information, other doctors can share information about your care that was shared previously through our ability to connect to other healthcare professionals around the community, et cetera. So that's my thought in that regard. I know wasn't a question there, so I don't know if that's an answer or a thought.
Well, it's funny because you've highlighted, I think, the need for education, because you said something at the beginning that I think actually is a change. Because what you said at the beginning is you used to ask this of your patient, and then where have you been seen? Have you been seen recently? All these questions. And then you would have them sign a request to be able to go get those records from these other providers, that's one, it probably wasn't required that you do that. But I know that is a consistent common practice, or it has been, to do it that way. And what we're saying is all of a sudden I removed that consent happening from the requesting provider. And that's a change of workflow, right? That's a change of thought. So the question to say, why don't I need to collect it to go get it from the other provider? And the fact of the matter is you actually don't under HIPAA. HIPAA says that it's the responsibility of the provider who's treating to make that information available to other providers. That makes the query networks work. But it is a change of workflow, and it is a change of thought. And whether it was bad workflow or bad education before, we have to overcome it.
Well, but remember, I was practicing before there were networks and before there were consents that were universal, so to speak, in the information sharing space. And we did need to ask patients permission to get their old records, to request their old records. They weren't automatically sent because where did the provider send them? The provider didn't know where to send them.
I don't think it's old, though. I think that practice...
that practice continues. That perception is still, that practice continues. Absolutely right. Yeah, I agree with that. So, and that's a really good point, because I wasn't really thinking of it from that perspective. I was thinking of it from the perspective of, you asked the question or framed, it wasn't a question, you threw out the conversation starter from the perspective of the patient being uncomfortable that this doctor had information that they didn't know was delivered. And I think the doctor being able to explain that, I was going to get your records anyway. This just comes at a time when it's more useful for me. And then going to say, and hey, in the new world, we don't have to ask consent. You're signing consent when you're being seen by that other provider to share that information in your best interest on your behalf. So
I did focus on the discomfort of the patient. But the question, I think, really stemmed from the discomfort of the provider. To say, I don't know how to answer that question. Before I could answer it with saying, well, you gave me your consent and I got the records, right? Now it's the discomfort. I think it truly comes back to the discomfort of the provider. Say, I don't know how to tell that patient. And it comes back to exactly what I've been pushing into is how far do we have to educate our providers on how these networks work? And where do we educate them so that they are informed on that process? And how hard is that? Who probably comes back to the who question also.
No, and Therasa, I think you're bringing up a good point, and I would say you're addressing a topic that requires standard education, and that's consent. Where is consent obtained, and to whom does it apply? What's the broad-reaching application of where that consent applies? I think that to me is a simple educational statement that can break down a lot of barriers and a lot of concern that providers have around having this information. Another one that came up off of that too, and you'll probably remember this question is, what if I query for a new patient's risk. So they could immediately, I was pleased that they could see the value of being able to have a new patient scheduled, query for the record, and get the record in advance of the appointment. But do you remember the question that came up that said, hey, if I query for this record and the patient doesn't show up, have I done something wrong? Am I going to be in trouble because I have this sitting in my computer and they never showed up? Again, another education point there, right? So as you use these as we go through these different workflows where interoperability impacts their ability to make good clinical decisions, good operational decisions in the office, being able to identify where those education points are and the questions that the doctors are going to have there. And generally it's going to be, where's the information coming from? Can I trust it? And do I have a right to have it? And then am I legally liable for it? And what happens? Educating in those regards from an interoperability perspective, again, it goes back to, in my mind, kind of the governance of it more than anything. Educating about that is far more important than educating about the tech pieces. We're talking about it in tech language, and educating about, hey, you don't need to ask for interoperability, but interoperability solves X, Y, and Z problem for you. That's a technology thing, right? That's we educate the technologists and say, hey, listen, when they're asking for this, they need interoperability. When they're asking for this workflow, they need interoperability, those kinds of things. So it's education of both parties. But I think for the docs, honestly, Therasa, it's probably, and I'm backing away from my perspective a little bit in the sense of I do believe that doctors need to know the impact of interoperability, because when they understand that, they can become the designers of their own workflow improvements. They can actually identify the problems that interoperability can solve, right? And I think there's power in that. I think there's absolute power in that.
In my mind all the time is it. Yes, I totally agree. Is them being educated on what the networks can do gives innovation, then reaches new levels because it's sitting in the hands of people that understand the impact at the deepest level.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And it puts the pressure, quite frankly, in the right place. The providers then put the pressure on our partners and us to deliver good solutions, right? And to help solve those problems. And this goes back to the provider experience perspective that we've talked about a lot, and I know is very close to your heart and obviously near and dear to mine. We have in the digital transformation in healthcare, largely through EHR implementation, put an increasing burden of change management, an increasing burden of process, and an increasing burden of work on the provider. So it's very rare that a provider out of the gate would tell you, no, I think this EHR is great. It saved me a lot of time, made things more convenient for me, et cetera. They might point out one or two things that are more convenient, et cetera. But I think by and large, the provider community would look at EHRs and say, this has not been a big help to me. It's actually made my life harder. There should be pressure on our partners, EHRs, and on us to decrease that burden through technology. Otherwise, the promise of technology is useless.
Yeah. It's not solving the biggest problems in healthcare.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. It's you caught me on a couple things that I totally agree. One, the innovation can't be unleashed until the provider community sits close to it. I still come back to, how do we educate at scale, given some of the questions that were in the room. Because the another question that they had is, one, we had talked about what their responsibility is for querying and having access to this information, but it was also the inverse of that. So who has access to my records? Who has access to my information? They can do that at any time. And there was this risk profile, almost sometimes I felt competitive, that people were concerned about the competitive components of that. But there's that education too. Is on the other side is, what does it mean to be a good provider, a good partner in the community by making your information available? If you want to be able to get it, we always say it's a penny in, penny out model. If you want to be able to get access to information, what should you make available as a provider in moving care forward? And that was a big piece of it. And then the last one of the other questions we had is, how do I know who has this capability? Awareness has always been, I always say it's a friction point, and it's one of the biggest friction points in interoperability. It's less about the technology versus the awareness of who has the technology. And that awareness should not, again, I'll come back to the technology vendors, as I always do. to say that shouldn't even be a question that your providers have. They should know, it should be a natural course of events that happen in the workflow. That as I register this patient, there's a query that the electronic health record vendor does against anybody in that area that's on the networks, because that's how those queries work. And you're pulling back information on their behalf. But the awareness piece always comes back to, how do I know who has this? Who's capable of communicating with me?
It's funny. I think awareness is a big deal. I would even say the awareness is, do I have this? Do I have this? Not who else has this. It starts with, do I have this available to me?
Yeah.
And what does it look like if I do? And how do I ask for it? How to get it turned on? Which goes back to a conversation that we've had for years, quite frankly, Teresa, around this is interoperability is not an option. Like when you're buying a car, right? You couldn't these days buy a car without a seatbelt. They wouldn't sell it to you, right? Now there's some regulatory things about wearing seatbelts in cars for safety reasons, decreasing injury and morbidity, mortality from motor vehicle accidents, and therefore cost to the insurance system and health system and all that kind of stuff that play into it. But you just can't buy a car without a seatbelt. But you can buy an EHR that may not be connected to the rest of the healthcare ecosystem.
Yep.
Again, another simple analogy, similar to buying a laptop without Wi-Fi. You wouldn't even consider that, right? It'd be almost useless these days. It's just an empty hard drive, right? Because everything's done online. But we have not gotten to the point where interoperability is foundational to the function of an electronic health record, such that every end user has it turned on and has some very minimal functions available to them in the get-go. And we've got to stop thinking that it's an option and that it's optional, because it's not an option if you're actually going to be competitive in the healthcare environment, both delivering better care, improved outcomes, and competitive from a cost of doing business perspective. But I think the awareness is a big issue. I do think that I like the comment around innovation at the edge by understanding the impact of interoperability and seeing new applications for interoperability based upon living in the Gemba every day and seeing what needs to be fixed. I do think it's an interesting question about how the networks work. And I think there probably needs to be a simplified understanding of, as we said earlier, the consent process, how networks work, and the reciprocity. I'm going to call it reciprocity. I don't think that's the true meaning of the word reciprocity as a place in network. What I'm talking about here is, you brought up a point of how much of my information is available. How much should I make available? Is that a threat to me? Is that a competitive threat to me? Is it a concern for me from a risk or liability perspective? Is it going to turn my patient sideways because I'm sharing their information for the purposes of healthcare? And I think those are all easily answered questions if we understand the sensitivity of what we're talking about. So in my mind, one of the questions around reciprocity, share my information. I would just say that it goes back to the golden rule. And this is a silly statement, but we all learn it in grade school. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it makes for a good society, right? And I think that it was always strange for me that doctors worried more about competition from one another than they did about the service they delivered to the patients in their office, which always wins, right? Yeah. So in my mind, and this goes back to this comment I've made at times about being a data socialist, kind of tongue in cheek. But the idea is, give every one of my internists in my office, in the offices next to me, the same information you give me. I am willing to compete on how I think through that information to make diagnoses, treatment decisions, management decisions, and how I deliver on the service that I'm able to deliver on because of that, whether it be from a cost of care perspective to payers and purchasers of healthcare, whether it be to quality and outcomes to an individual patient. That's what we should be competing on. And I think that we've got to get out of this mode that this is going to be a competitive thing. If they have my information, I have their information. We've gotten into this mode over the last 2 decades, and I won't get off on this tangent, but we've gotten into this mode over the last 2 decades where data is currency. and everybody feels like they've got to hold on to it so they can make some sort of monetization out of it. And as providers, we got to get out of that. Our monetization comes from having as much data as we can and giving as much data as we can to care for patients so that we can actually provide the best outcomes. So anyway, that's when you said that, that's what that kind of stimulated in my head a little bit. Now they need to understand it's safe to get their data, that people aren't coming in and mining their records for, those kind of things, and understand the broad nature of the data that gets distributed. But again, that's really a simple education. I mean, I'm thinking in my head here, Teresa, there's a 1 or 2 pager that really answers some of these frequent questions about the networks and so forth that can be distributed, that will answer 80% of the providers' concerns and fears to make them literate at the level of initial interoperability that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's education at scale is what moves us to the next level. When I say us, the industry of interoperability and getting our healthcare system connected. And it's going to take a tribe to do that. It's going to take, starting, we'll look in the mirror first, is what happens here. How are we educating the HIT vendors that integrate with us to make sure that they're educating in accuracy to their provider community? Because it's every peg in the board here that goes down, it gets diluted and education could be wrong. And so I sit here and I feel just speaking as the founder of the company, the pressure to educate the market at scale, to make sure we're good custodians, to make sure that people understand the impact, but more importantly, to give them the freedom to say, man, that's what we can do. Imagine what we can do here. We can have this impact, which truly, we always talk about I won't say negative is the word, but the downside, and making sure people are educated about all the stuff that could happen. But the benefit is so much bigger.
Yeah.
Back to that, it's so much bigger on going down that path. So it does remind me of you were speaking to, I can't remember how you stated it, but looking in the mirror first, saying, what information should I do? What should I be doing as a provider? And I like that. As I was sitting, I think I had related this experience in the previous podcast, or a couple of them ago, with my father. I was sitting at his neurologist. She had a very well-known EHR, and she had no idea, because she had not been educated, that she could actually access my dad's records on demand right there. I showed her in her electronic health record. I mean, you should have seen the moment that was for her. But she almost didn't know what to do with it. Like, wow, I had no idea. But I was like, man, this is a total breakdown of the technology sector in not educating our provider community for what's sitting in there. So it did spark me saying it was unfortunate, because she would have definitely taken advantage of it.
But it goes back to the awareness issue that we talked about, right? Not just an awareness of interoperability and who we can connect to, but an awareness that I have the ability already in my EHR to connect, which is the simplest form of education, to be honest with you, the awareness piece. You said something that's interesting to me, because we always talk about a fragmented healthcare system and how difficult it is to interact with a healthcare system with any understanding of what you're supposed to do. And, your father, my father, 86, just got back from a nice RV trip with my dad and my 2 brothers to back where he was from, where my mother's buried, in their town where they grew up in. And it was a great time. But I always think of my father when I think about healthcare stories, and I don't know how he navigates through the healthcare system if he didn't have a son in healthcare, right? And he's got a son that's a banker, a son that's an accountant, and a son that's a physician. And so they're all smart, but knowing how to interpret what's said, where to go, what's necessary, what's not necessary. I don't know how you do that if you don't have a friend or family member in healthcare. I'll tell you, for doctors, I don't know how you understand the technology and whether it's helpful for you or not if you don't have a friend in tech. So how do we be the friend to a provider in tech, as a company, as individuals, so that we can actually eliminate the fear and concern and frustration of trying to manage through all these promised tools and promised solutions to the right simple solutions. And oftentimes they are simpler than we think they are. They are right in front of us and they're available. We just don't know how to use them because somebody hasn't spent the time with us to tell us about that. And we're trying to navigate our understanding of those tools in the run of doing everything that we do for our patients to begin with. So it was interesting you said that. I kind of flip it and say, where's my friend in technology as a provider that can help me in those areas?
Well, I guess that's kind of a call to action to all of our partners and to ourselves, is continuing to improve our communication and what we're making available in education to the provider community. Because if our providers are set free, the healthcare system is set free. That's been the foundation
I
of
love
starting,
that.
because we can care for our patients. Go ahead.
Teresa, one of the other things is, as we kind of draw this segment to a close, I think you said a couple of things that's I wanted to react to. One was, and now I'm, in my traditional fashion, I'm forgetting what I had wanted to react to. One of them was around the idea that educating providers and educating the community as a whole around interoperability, and more importantly, its impact and the awareness of its availability. And one of the things that attracted me to Kno2fy from the very beginning, 10 years ago when I started consulting with you folks, is we have chosen the hardest road because we've chosen to take on that burden. We've chosen to take on that burden with our partners, with our providers. And there is an enormous cost from a time perspective and money perspective in doing that. But if we're not doing it, nobody else is. And maybe that's strong. Maybe there are other folks, but if somebody's not doing it, nobody is, right? And so while it is costly to our business model, while it is time intensive, while it takes time because it has a long runway, education, very rare, epiphany has a turnaround tomorrow. Education may have a turnaround in months, right? It takes a while to educate people to understand it, because it has to be, the education has to be relevant to a problem they're having at the moment. And then they have the epiphany and it turns things around. So, but kudos to you as a founder of the company for not relegating or dismissing the need for education of the community, both technologists in terms of the impact, providers in terms of some of this limited technology governance and so forth, because that is an incredibly important thing that leads to adoption at the edge. And it is what will ultimately make interoperability successful, right? Not only adoption, and when I say adoption, that's another thing too. We used to talk in terms of who, what, where, and when, and how, leading to a successful implementation. It's the why, which is the impact that I'm talking about, that leads to adoption. And that's what I mean about the importance of the providers understanding the impact of this technology that leads to adoption. And adoption is the long-term use, right? So it's one thing to implement it and we can turn a bunch of people on, but if nobody's using it, that's not adoption. It doesn't actually do what we're trying to do from a standpoint of improving care, sharing information at the point of care. So, and then there was one other thing that you said, and I cannot remember what it is. Maybe I'll remember it by the time the next segment comes around, and be able to talk about that.
I guess we'll kind of leave it with this statement, because I often get asked is why is interoperability not everywhere? And there's
I asked you that when I met you guys.
there's always these long-winded answers about it's a technology problem, it's a compliance problem, it's the incentive hasn't been there. And there's truth in all of them, of course, but it always has come down to, my response is always, the technology is not frictionless for the provider, and the provider's not educated. And if you narrow it down to those two, that puts, again, the onus on the technology provider to do just a really good job of implementation and integration, workflow. And then let's expand it to education of the provider community. The rest will go away. The groundswell will create such a movement. The rest will figure themselves out. And these other ones have just been a distraction of why we're not there with interoperability everywhere, especially now since we have these national networks. So I think it's been a great conversation today. Kind of wrap it up there. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. Can I react to that? I know you want to wrap it up, and this is your episode, so I'm stepping on your toes. But as I think about that, what you just said, I would ask this question, and I mean it to be somewhat offensive and provocative. Has interoperability made healthcare communication better or worse easier or more difficult over the last 20 years?
I think it's done both. If you're asking me that, and I'm standing on stage here, I think we have gone through I think it's Gartner's hype cycle, but we've gone through the trough of disillusionment, they call it, where poor interoperability implemented, not getting. It's been so much about the technology. It's done both, but I also think we're coming out of that where the benefits are being seen and it's making the lives of providers easier, as we've learned. And so, do I get to say both? Do I get to say C, all the above?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a, yeah, that's kind of a cop-out answer, but yes.
To me, that's what
yeah. I anticipated it might be a little bit offensive. Wasn't the intent. Provocative was, because I do think if you ask providers, has the conversation around interoperability and the technology of interoperability made my communication with other providers and across the healthcare system any better? I would imagine that most of them would say no. Or I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't see the communication happening. And again, that's one of the things that this isn't what I haven't remembered what I wanted to comment on yet, but this is another thing that came back to me. Was one of the reasons that I appreciate the I'm trying to think what the right word is. It's not a catchphrase, but the not logo. I cannot help me with the word, for heaven's sake. It's that Kno2fy is an interoperability company, but it's leading the future of healthcare communication, right? Because that to me is absolutely critical. And I think we've lost the idea that we're actually trying to create communication at scale.
Yep.
Through interoperability, right? And that to me really resonates with me. And I think I want people to understand that interoperability is just a technological word for communication at scale. And to your point about frictionless, we have work to do there to make it frictionless, work to do on the education around the impact for adoption. But I wanted to come back to that. Sorry.
Well, I think we can leave it with, and I'm pretty sure I've worn this tagline out kind of at scale, but I'm going to say it again. When interoperability moves from a noun to a verb, we will have solved that problem. That comes back to frictionless discussions around workflow, not what interoperability as a thing. Like, can I get two of them? That's what you think you're buying this thing, and you're not, right? You're buying the outcome, the workflow. Well, this has been a great conversation. Maybe we should take a quick break, and then we'll come back and wrap it up.
Sounds good.
Hey everyone, my name is Matt Becker, VP of Interoperability at Kno2fy. I wanted to take a moment to introduce our connectivity report. Did you ever wonder who in your area you could connect with digitally and reduce the manual activities associated with clinical information exchange? Well, simply visit Kno2fy.com, click the link for connectivity report, then enter your name, email, and zip code, and we'll send you a report to show those providers and provider organizations already connected and waiting for you to join them. Take the first step to getting Kno2fy connected. It's free, takes less than 30 seconds, and will spark digital transformation that could revolutionize your business. There's even a how-to video to make sure you get the most from the report.
Connect, listen, transform. This is Kno2fy with your hosts, Dr. Peter Schoch and Therasa Bell.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll take just a couple minutes here to wrap it up and some closing thoughts. Been a great conversation today. Really insightful. Again, I'll say that always putting yourselves in different shoes is great because it helps to solve the problem. And for me, sitting in that provider audience, listening to the questions that sit in their mind, it only leads to understanding and what we can do better as a company. And I loved that experience. I'm going to do it more often. That's what I've committed myself to do. But any parting thoughts here, Dr. Schoch, as we close down this episode?
We stimulated one that wasn't originally on my docket as a parting thought, but
did you remember your other one? I just
no, not yet. No, but the education to me is bidirectional too, and I think you just emphasized that in terms of how we approach it. It's incredibly important for us to have our ear to the rail of our provider end users who are benefiting from the impact of interoperability so that we can be educated around what are the emerging problems that interoperability can be a solution to. How do we talk about those? How do we message those? How do we provide the solutions that do that on a regular basis? So I think that's one point that I hadn't thought about emphasizing, but I think it is, based upon what you said, a point to emphasize because we feel a strong commitment to there. And then how do we educate the community? And when I say the community of technology partners that are integrating and making interoperability technically possible and available to their end users. And how do we educate the end users on the differences between interoperability now and when they used to make a phone call, and the governance importance there, and also the impact pieces. I think that all is it seems like it's nicely tied up in those statements, but there's a huge amount of complexity in there that we have to work through and simplify for providers. But I think those are key things to driving adoption at the edge. And I, too, like you, am just always jazzed to sit down with providers, whether it be on podcasts like we did, or technology partners like on podcasts we did, or with them in person to hear about their questions, their reactions, their understanding. And Trace, I will say that in a room like that, when you have the right questions being asked that are honest, authentic questions coming from a place of a provider actually trying to use it and seeing the pragmatic use of it, and you have the right people answering the questions, education blossoms very, very quickly there. And you could see it as they build off of one another's questions and the right answers, the succinct right answers to those questions. You could see the collective understanding of the value of what was being brought to them rise in the room. So
yeah, it was a great discussion. So I think that'll wrap it up today. Look forward to talking again on the next subject. But thank you again for everybody's time, and have a great day.
Have a great day. Thanks, Teresa.
Thanks for joining us today. That's a wrap for this episode. Please subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform to make sure you don't miss an episode. Get Kno2 connected today and set yourself and your organization free to unlock your potential. For more information on the value of being Kno2 connected, visit us at www.kno2.com. Follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. Connect, listen, transform.